Vår nästa talare kommer tala om någonting som är väldigt relevant just nu. Och det är kriget i Ukraina. Men inte om vapen och pistoler och sånt, utan här är det digitala kriget i Ukraina. Matthew Ford, som är universitetslektor och docent på Försvarshögskolan, kan tyvärr inte vara här. Men vi har ett förinspelat samtal med honom och David Lindahl, forskare på FOI, som vi kommer att lyssna på. Och efteråt så kommer Matthew att komma in och svara på frågor, så att ni kommer fortfarande kunna ställa era frågor. Var vänliga och ställ era frågor på engelska så att det blir lätt att förmedla dem till honom. Tack.
So, hi Matthew. Why are we on camera instead of on stage?
Hi David, thanks very much for having me. I'm currently obviously recording this, but by the time you get to hear this broadcast, I'll be in Vienna doing at a workshop talking about the same things actually that we're talking about today.
Right. And today we'll be talking about the digital warfare or digital battlefield of Ukraine. How would you describe that?
Well, I think the interesting thing about this war is it's the most connected war in history, right? There is no other example of something like this going on. Whilst we're seeing a lot of the usual things that you would experience from a war, as in the kinetic side of things, the tanks, the artillery, the aircraft, and all the other things associated with military formations and all the rest of it, how we come to know and understand what's going on is through a deeply mediated space that is the digital. Everyone is connected, including people on the front lines and including us viewing this stuff from Stockholm or from London or from wherever we are in the world. And I'm interested in what that does in terms of how we participate in this information space and how that shapes our understanding and our engagement with war.
Now you're talking about engagement as in we are shaping, we are forming this space even as spectators, or the way we use it, the way we take part is no longer a passive one, correct?
Correct, absolutely. You can see that. I've been talking about this in terms of war in the age of the smartphone. The smartphone has kind of revolutionized how anyone can engage with war, whether they're on the front lines, recording things, uploading it up to a headquarters for lessons learned, or providing drone feeds so that you can adjust fire onto targets, or actually broadcast stuff directly if you're a particular media relations officer for a unit, broadcast stuff directly, edited or not, up to TikTok or Twitter, or Telegram is the usual platform, of course. But it's the same now for people in different parts of the world who can engage with this stuff and amplify it. They can edit it. They can feed into the propaganda, into the misinformation type way we're communicating about the war. And you don't have to be on the front lines. You don't even have to be in Ukraine. And that has a lot of implications, it seems to me, for how we think about all sorts of issues in terms of armed conflict, whether it's cyber, information warfare, but all the way through to targeting and kinetic type activities as well. And so on the one hand, whilst we're seeing everything that looks very familiar from a perspective of those in uniform, from the perspective of those at FOI, at the same time, there is a dimension here that needs to be thought, in my opinion anyway, needs to be thought about again. And that's what I've been describing in terms of digital war or digital warfare and connectivity and combat.
Yeah, you mentioned misinformation, and I want to add something to that. Something that surprised me at the beginning of this war was the incredible amount of what I would consider collated intelligence that was available through open source data, and the amount of people all over the world who started cooperating and creating an intelligence picture that was far better than anything I would have expected of a battlefield, even from a command and control system before this, say Falklands, say Georgia, or whatever.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, the sources of data are not necessarily only controlled by the armed forces. So literally, someone who's online and connected is a data point on a map somewhere. The challenge is to get that data into something that's meaningful and that can be used by people working in the newspapers, doing in mainstream media, but also ultimately can shape how armed forces think about themselves. So there was a very interesting interview in the New York Times with General Milley the other day, where they took I think it was the New York Times, they took the journalist down into the command bunker and they had a map on the wall. And of course, it was one of the open source intelligence maps, that was sort of representing, based on all of the data that people are providing, collating and putting up onto one of these maps. And, immediately you might think, well, the armed forces in the US are using these maps. Well, only insofar, I mean, obviously, US intelligence capabilities are much, much more superior to a whole range of other countries. And I don't think for a moment they necessarily have to rely on open source stuff, but they can at least track how open source people are, what's going on in the open source world, and relate it back to what they're seeing on a military perspective. I think it's fair to say, though, that the open source stuff is definitely shaping understanding, shaping how we engage with the war. It's being repeated back through mainstream media, as well as being reproduced on social media. And there are a number of organizations that are involved in doing it, from the Institute of the Study of War to a bunch of Finns who I know very well, who have been working on this as well. It's definitely having an impact, if not on the actual targeting itself, but I think there are instances where it is directly impacting targeting. It's definitely shaping understanding, and that's been crucial, it seems to me, for ministries of defense and ministries of foreign affairs to try and reflect on how that is working, because in many respects they are having open source intelligence stuff is having more impact, for good or bad. It's having more impact on public understanding than on public pronouncements by even something like the UK Ministry of Defence, which have been doing daily briefings. That's not to say that open source intelligence is going to revolutionize things, but it's definitely a factor, and an important factor, that needs to be taken into account when we start thinking about military campaigns, when we think about public understanding, and when we think about even how intelligence services work as well.
I was thinking about what you said about the age of the smartphone. And I was discussing with a couple of colleagues that what we basically have these days is an extremely dense sensor net spread out over the landscape that we couldn't even imagine a couple of decades ago. And if we start to access this in an organized manner, let's say that a nation state demands that you have surveillance on your phones and you are required to use it. For example, when you see something of interest for your military, you are required to film it and report it. Would that be, in your opinion, revolutionizing intelligence, or adding as yet unused layer?
So I mean, it's a really good question. I think, first thing to note is that under peacetime conditions, the state doing that kind of surveillance is controlled and is shaped, certainly in Western democracies, is shaped by frameworks around about privacy and the law. Of course, in other parts of the world where things are more authoritarian, those apps are potentially automatically loaded onto smartphones, and people are under surveillance. They're under the conditions of surveillance state. Here, it's surveillance capitalism, right? This is how people are engaged using their phones, because actually it's more beneficial to use their phone because they get access to cheaper services and goods, and things happen more quickly. And all of that information is collated by companies, corporates, to help them deliver services more effectively. Obviously, that produces data that can be then sold on to data brokerages, which then can be collated for other purposes. But in terms of in wartime, it seems to me that some of those rules associated with how data is produced, captured, and made use of potentially has the rules will start to change. The context has changed, right? Things have become existential and under those circumstances, the state might make alternative demands about how data is used, especially and this is, it seems to me, where your good point about smartphones, you know, the smartphone is a very, very sophisticated bit of technology that has GPS, a mic, a camera, and various other bits of software that associated with it, which have, and it's, and so many people have these devices. I'm trying to, I think it was some, I think I picked up a stat the other day. There are 6.2 billion smartphones out there in the world. And if you look at the Internet Telecoms Union, the United Nations agency responsible for all things telecoms, you'll find that pretty much the entire world is connected. And even in least developed countries, you know, you're looking at a good, a high degree of connectivity, not as sophisticated as the West maybe, but the net result is that you know, people have got their phones, they're online, everyone's connected, and you've got a very sophisticated sensor grid that is moving around with the person, and increasingly, and you saw that in some discussions by Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Alphabet, and formerly the head of the Defense Innovation Board in the Pentagon, talking about how the US needs to harness some of that technology as we move forwards. Right now, whether they pick it up in terms of smartphone use or they have an equivalent military set of sensors doing that work, I think is an open question. But the fact is that, you know, the general public have got these devices. It seems obvious to me that the state or the military will, or intelligence services at some point or other, if they aren't already thinking about it, and I'm pretty confident that they are, will start to think about how to make use of, operationalize that under conditions of war.
Right. Which immediately brings up the question, when you say bound by laws, would be, can I target them or not?
I think that's a really tough and open question. You know, if the open source intelligence community are not all located in Ukraine, but are still providing information to Ukrainian targeteers, then are those open source intelligence analysts who are located in the EU or NATO, are they suddenly viable targets? The EU and NATO have not yet defined whether the IT army of Ukraine, for those people who are working outside of Ukraine, what their combatant status is.
Could
and
you
it seems to me
clarify, shortly clarify, what is the IT army of Ukraine?
Yeah, sure. So the IT army of Ukraine was set up a couple of days after after the start of the special military operation last year, to help Ukraine with disinformation, information campaigns, and cyber attacks. And they're about, on the Telegram channel that coordinates the IT army of Ukraine, there are about 340,000 subscribers to that channel. So I'm not saying that I wouldn't want to guess as to how many of those people are active users, but, you know, some of them are Ukrainian, some of them are from all over the world, and you know, we've created this. The Ukrainians have created this. They're accountable to Ukraine, but they're virtual. Where do they go? What do we do? Now we've created them, what do we do with it? We've sort of got this unanticipated or emergent capability that's come out of Ukraine working out how to digitally mobilize society, and it's produced all these changes in how warfare can be prosecuted that are not fitting in within a NATO EU 20th century framing of warfare, it seems to me. And that's what makes it quite kind of, well, from a researcher's point of view, an academic point of view like mine, you know, it's fascinating stuff, but it forces us to think about the nature of participation. This is not total war as you might describe it in terms of Second World War, where you mobilize society and, you know, drive organization and military structures and defense industrial policy on the basis of total war. There's something else going on here, and I don't think and I've been framing this in terms of participative warfare, to try and get that digital domain into our way of thinking about how warfare is unfolding. And I don't think in that respect, it's not an attempt on my part to deny the significance of kinetic and all things kinetic. It's just to say we need to broaden our perspective a little bit to try and engage with what it means to do this, to do kinetic when we are, as I said, in a deeply mediated digital space.
I totally agree. There's a part of cyber warfare where you have direct support to the kinetic side, where you shut down infrastructure and so on. But
Yeah.
there are so many activities going on in the infosphere, or what do you want to call it, where that doesn't map with ordinary warfare, but does now influence the kinetic warfare.
Yes.
One of the things I would like to bring up is the use of civilian infrastructure, where
Yes.
the development and the design of civilian infrastructure may affect warfare or usability depending on how it's set up. For example, if a telecom system is set up so that the various companies can access traffic or not, that might be dependent on a nation. For example, like the United States might be able to siphon off data from telecommunication industry and so on. But would that lead to companies being considered part of the warfare because their infrastructure is used or because they are used? Like, for example, Elon Musk decided to shut off satellites and directly impact war. Would he be considered an actor of digital warfare?
So I think what you just described is the multiplicity of actors that are engaged now, or more prominent in a way that may not have been very obvious when we were thinking about connectivity and warfare and the role of internet, all the rest of it over the last 20 years. And Ukraine has sort of exposed some of the multiple factors that are shaping how we come to know and understand the war. I mean, just to go back to your point about telecoms grids, fixed line connectivity is important in those parts of the world that came up with the telecoms grid early on in the 20th century. But of course, outside of Europe and North America, cell phone grid networks are more important for connectivity. All of this shapes the latency and speed and the viability of these grids for military use. And Elon Musk's and I spotted today that Amazon Web Services are launching a rival system to Elon Musk's satellite-based internet comms net grid. That adds layers of challenge for those people who want to try and control the information space. If everyone's going to be able to get online at any time, all the time, irrespective of whether they are under conditions of occupation or not, that reshapes actually how the information space works. It also reshapes what is viable for cyber attack. And I'm sure it's not far from the realms of credibility for an actor in war to decide that they've had enough of a particular company or private sector organization and decide that we can justify this on the basis of they are facilitating warfare in a way that's unhelpful to us. And I think that's just the way things are going. And we've seen early signs of that already. Viasat went down early on in the war, and saved by Elon briefly until it's the fickle nature of Elon goes to show you that actually a marketplace of organizations that can of private sector companies that can provide this support is going to be essential. Otherwise, states are going to be at the beck and call of a particular private sector organization.
Right. We're coming up on 20 minutes, which was our allotted time. So I was going to ask you, if you were to give the audience a takeaway or something specifically you want to highlight or bring up, either summarize or something you think we missed. what would that be?
So I think a lot of people have been focusing on innovation from a military perspective. And what I'm fascinated by is, I'm fascinated by the whole nature of how war and participation has changed, but also the innovation ecosystem associated with military and the armed forces and society is sort of having to adjust and take into account changes in the digital domain. And so I think, and that's not a, that's that I think Ukraine has sort of shown that we need to pay attention to the local in terms of the transformation space and how innovation works. It's not just a top-down exercise from Silicon Valley.
Right. Okay, so now I'll cut off this tape part of the interview and turn over to the moderator and the question time. Thank you very much.
Ja, med oss har vi Matthew Ford som kommer besvara våra frågor. Skriv gärna era frågor nu så att vi hinner ta dem. Matthew Ford, can you hear me?
I can indeed. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Perfect.
That's excellent.
I was wondering, are we surprised at all over how big part of the war is digital? Or was there any prediction before the war that the smartphone era, this new modern era, that warfare will change?
So I think it's a very good question. I think one thing I'd say is, and I can't remember whether I said it when we recorded it, but there's a few weeks ago, but it's not reasonable to say that there's nothing kinetic going on. So, you know, something very analog going on in Ukraine. We're still talking about bombs and bullets and things that produce death in very recognizable ways. But it seems to me that there's also something very digital going on as well. And some of the precursors to that, I think places, you can see it now actually in Israel, are the obvious places where you can see how the state has tried to shape and frame the digital. But you can see other places in the world, the civil war in Syria, but it's an obvious place. Mosul, a lot of other places where digitization has shaped the conduct of war, how smartphones have played a role in that. But also, I mean, the history of that, I think, is also somewhat hazy or forgotten. You know, the actual use of smartphones or use of connected technologies, not just for propaganda or for informational purposes, but for also for targeting or rest of it. The history of that, I think, is somewhat buried. And from what I can see, and I think it needs a bit of research, but from just talking to a few people, anthropologists and others, it's clear that there are quite a few instances of wars where connected devices have played quite important roles in shaping targeting. And, you know, I spotted journalist reports going back to 2011 in Libya where connected devices were actually playing, and civilians were playing important roles in NATO's battle damage assessment, targeting activities and all the rest of it. So there is a history there, but I wonder whether whilst we're focusing on networked war as it's framed by the armed forces, we kind of leave that civilian engagement out of the picture. And I think that's the bit that probably needs to be recovered a little bit so that we can start to understand the digital in its entirety when it comes to the conduct of war, not just in terms of how the armed forces are thinking about employing digital stuff.
Very
Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It does make sense. But, and also, I was wondering, you mentioned this IT army of Ukraine,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I understood was basically civilians from all over the world who created this.
Yes.
Are they considered as combatants of the war?
So from what I can tell, and maybe there are people on this call that know more about it than me, and if you do, then I'd be very pleased to hear from you. But from what I understand, at least, there are a core group of Ukrainian officers, colonels, who are actively shaping some of or giving a sense of direction, setting tram lines, if you like, for where the IT army of Ukraine might direct its efforts. But from there, it's grown in such a way that, as you say, there's a lot of people. The Telegram channel has something like 300. I can't remember what I said in the call now, but at least 325,000 subscribers. Whether they're all active or not, I don't know, but it's an indication of the activity of the channel, and those people are located wherever around in the world. And it's fair to say that the EU and NATO have not worked out what the combatant status of those people involved in that activity are. I think that does present problems. And not least, now we have the IT arm of Ukraine. Where does it go next? With the war in Ukraine's over, I hope we're successful for Ukraine, but they've created a capability that doesn't fit within a framework that we currently understand.
Is the civilian part of the war larger than it was predicted before?
I think that's a very good question. I don't know the answer to it, and I would hesitate to give you a definitive answer. I think the implication is that we're talking about anyone who has enough coding experience and enough understanding about how to direct information activities and enough capacity to load up a bit of code onto their computer and then press the go key, and it fires off whatever cyber command or gamifies some DDoS attack or whatever. I think it's probably whether it's more sophisticated. My investigations into that space are limited, so I'm not going to claim I know in detail. But it's one of those areas that probably is worth doing a lot more research on. How easy that will be, given that we're talking about human subjects in a digital domain where it's a war. You can straight away see the ethical research challenges associated with doing that. Even though it's very important, clearly it's also very important research. That demographic study could be very instructive and very useful for all sorts of reasons. But then it highlights exactly the point you were making. If we suddenly find that 60% of the population of the IT arm of Ukraine is EU citizens, what happens then, right? We've got a challenge, which is one reason maybe why no one actually wants to properly ask the question, because the answer might not actually be the kind of answer that you want to hear.
I was thinking, are we more prepared for this in the future now that we have seen it in Ukraine? This digital part of war?
That's a very good question. I think the workshop that we did in August, which I didn't talk about directly in our conversations, but the workshop that we did in August, we had a number of private sector companies, including Recorded Future, Amazon Web Services, and another company, the name of which, for whatever reason, escapes me, but I'm sure someone on this call will know or remember. I think it's fair to say that there's one is that Ukraine has proved to be quite an experimental space for testing and trying to understand what works and what doesn't, both from a private sector and from the point of view of government. And that may have stress tested a whole heap of things and sort of created more readiness on our part. But when you're in a kinetic context, I think it's also fair to say that people are going to keep trying to adapt and change. So, it's forever watching. And I know that from talking to people in the cyber industry, they're always facing cyber attack. I guess that represents policy. There's a sort of policy challenges in there, how to organize and how to avoid calling wolf. If we keep talking about cyber attack, and nothing happens, then people start to get a bit complacent, and we're not sure what that actually implies for preparing society and all the rest of it. So there are clearly challenges in there about how to think about preparedness in the context of a post-Ukraine scenario. But and I think there's still a lot of reckoning to be done. What's the balance of activity, private sector versus Ukraine versus US government versus, there's a lot of work that needs to be done probably to map that, to understand the full implications and reality of the situation.
Yes, I agree. Do we have any more questions?
There must be another one.
There must be another one.
You can hear me in the airport here. Look, you see, there's planes. I am here.
Okay,
Eventually, I might make it to Stockholm.
it seems like we don't have any further questions, Matthew. Thank
No
you very
problem.
much for speaking to us, and have a safe
Pleasure.
trip.
Looking forward to meeting you all at some point in the future.